On the first day of its opening, 600 immigrants were admitted through Ellis Island. Over the next year, over 400,000 passed through this port of entry. From 1892 to 1924, approximately 12 million immigrants arriving at the Port of New York and New Jersey were processed through Ellis Island. It's estimated that about 40% of all current U.S. citizens can trace at least one of their ancestors to Ellis Island, which is positioned at the mouth of the Hudson River in New York.
The United States is a place where people of every nation, race, language, or belief can come together and experience the freedoms to pursue their dreams. Because of what happened this month in history, we can look around today and see diverse Americans leading in the way of business, entertainment, science, tech, government, and beyond. And there's so much more to come. Though we've had our ups and downs, the United States remains a land of liberty and promise. For centuries, the world's citizens have made their way to America to find new beginnings. In fact, it was in this month, back in 1892, that Ellis Island opened its gates to men, women, and children ready to plant new roots. These roots have bloomed into over 100 million Americans who can trace their ancestry through Ellis Island.
The island is named after its former owner, Samuel Ellis, a colonial New Yorker and merchant. But before him, the Native American name for the island was Kiosk, meaning Gull Island, due to its large population of seagulls. Kiosk was composed mostly of marshy, brackish lowlands. It is unlikely the Native Americans established any permanent structures on Kiosk, since the island would have been completely submerged at high tide. The island was bought in 1630 by the Dutch. The three islands in Upper New York Bay, Liberty, Black Tom, and Ellis Islands, were combined by giving them the name Oyster Islands, due to the large oyster population. Present-day Ellis Island was distinguished from the other oyster islands by giving it the name Little Oyster Island. Obviously, creativity wasn't much of a priority in the early process of island naming. By the 1760s, Little Oyster Island became a site for the public execution of pirates, specifically at a tree called the Gibbet Tree. Public executions acted as a warning to citizens of the fate of one who entered into the trade of piracy. Ellis Island was used for official military business for about 80 years. By the 1790s, as a result of the United States' increased military tensions with Britain and France, Congress drew a map of possible locations for major fortifications. The state built forts on Bedloes, Ellis, and Governor's Islands. Batteries and magazines were built on Ellis Island. They were preparing it for war, but a military conflict failed to occur, and by 1805, the fort had become run down. The Ellis family still owned most of the island, and it was suggested to sell off the land to the government. Ultimately, the remaining portion of the island was acquired by condemnation the next year, and it was ceded to the United States in 1808 for $10,000. Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Williams, placed in charge of New York harbor defenses, proposed several new fortifications around the harbor as part of the second system of fortifications. The new fortifications included many upgrades in firepower. The War Department established a circular stone 14-gun battery, a mortar battery, and barracks. The fort was initially called Crown Fort, but by the end of the War of 1812, the battery was named Fort Gibson in honor of Colonel James Gibson of the 4th Regiment. The fort was not used in combat during the war and instead served as a barracks for the 11th Regiment, as well as a jail for British prisoners of war. Expansions were made during the Civil War, but after the fighting ceased, the fort declined again, this time to an extent that the weaponry was rendered unusable. Castle Clinton had processed more than 8 million immigrants since 1855. But the federal government noted Castle Clinton as having varied charges of mismanagement, abuse of immigrants, and evasion of the laws, and as such, wanted to be done with it. The federal government took control of immigration in early 1890 and commissioned a study to determine the best place for the new immigration station in New York Harbor. Among members of the United States Congress, there was deliberation on whether to build on Ellis, Governors, or Liberty Island. On April 11, 1890, the federal government ordered the structures at Ellis Island to be torn down and replaced by the U.S.'s first federal immigration station. The Department of the Treasury, which was in charge of constructing federal buildings in the U.S., officially took control of the island. During construction, Ellis Island's land size was almost doubled to 6 acres. The main structure had 2 stories and was constructed out of Georgia pine. The station opened January 1, 1892. The first immigrant to pass through the island was Annie Moore, a 17-year-old Irish girl. Along with her 2 brothers, she was traveling to the States to meet her parents, who were already here. Over the next 12 months, 400,000 immigrants would be processed at Ellis Island. The processing procedure included a series of medical and mental inspections, and through this process, about 1% of potential immigrants were rejected and deported. More expansions were added throughout the 1890s, and Ellis Island grew to 14 acres. On June 15, 1897, the wooden structures on Ellis Island were completely consumed in a fire. There were no casualties, but the wooden buildings had completely burned down after 2 hours, and all immigration records from 1855 had been destroyed. The cause of the fire was unknown. After the fire, the barge office began processing passenger arrivals, which was soon found ill-equipped to handle the influx of immigrants. Plans were made to build a new fireproof immigration station. The Treasury's supervising architect, James Knox Taylor, opened an architecture competition to rebuild the immigration station. The rules of the contest made specific mention of the use of fireproof materials. Additionally, the buildings had to be able to host an average of 1,000 immigrants per day and a maximum of 4,000 per day. There were several prominent architectural firms that filed proposals, but the winners would end up being Edward Lippincott Tilton and William A. Boring. Tilton and Boring's plan called for 4 new structures, a main building in the French Renaissance style, as well as the kitchen laundry building, powerhouse, and the main hospital building. The plan also included the creation of a new island called Island 2, yet another amazing example of island naming skills in the 1800s. On this Island 2, the hospital would be built just south of the existing island. With the start of a new century and a couple years after commencing construction, the station was opened on December 17, 1900, but without pomp or circumstance. That day, 2,251 immigrants were processed through the building. The building had a job to do, and it did just that. Additional projects were quickly commenced to assist the main structure, including an entrance canopy, baggage conveyor, and railroad ticket office. A ferry house was also built between the islands 1 and 2. The facilities proved barely able to handle the flood of immigrants that arrived, and as early as 1903, immigrants had to remain in their transatlantic boats for several days due to inspection backlogs. Substantial changes to Ellis Island's appearance were made by Immigration Commissioner William Williams. Plants, paths, and landscaping was laid on the formerly barren ground. Under Williams's guidance, a 3rd island was built to accommodate a contagious diseases ward. When deciding upon the name on which to call this 3rd island, William Williams drew upon the naming skills that he obviously inherited from his parents. After what we can only assume were many sleepless nights, William Williams called it Island 3. A crib walk connected the islands on their western side, giving Ellis Island an overall E shape. Upon the completion of Island 3 in 1906, Ellis Island covered 20 acres. The structures on Black Tom Island were heavily damaged during the Black Tom explosion of 1916. 2 million tons of war materials packed into train cars had blown up in the Black Tom Railroad Yard on what is now a part of Liberty State Park. German agents were determined to prevent Americans from supplying munitions to its English enemy during the First World War. This act of sabotage was not only one of the largest artificial non-nuclear explosions to have ever occurred, but one of the last provocations that enticed America into joining World War I. During the war, the immigration station was repaired and temporarily closed in order to use the facilities as a jail for suspected enemy combatants, and later as a hospital for the wounded soldiers. Immigration nearly came to a standstill with the passing of the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the Immigration Act of 1924. Ellis Island was effectively changed into an immigrant detention center, the final stop before deportation. Immigration slowed even more after the stock market crash of 1929. Immigrants were apparently less attracted to a country in the midst of a Great Depression. Operation expenses for the small detention center were fairly large, and by 1947, shortly after the end of World War II, there were proposals to close Ellis Island. By the early 1950s, there were only about 40 detainees left on the island. Ellis Island officially closed on November 12, 1954, with the departure of its last detainee, a Norwegian merchant seaman by the name of Arne Petersen. In 1970, some restoration efforts were beginning, mainly focusing on the landscaping, seawalls, and ferry dock. The Restore Ellis Island Committee was launched to raise awareness and funding for repairs. The north side of the island, with the main building, was rehabilitated and partially reopened for public tours in May of 1976. By 1990, the main building officially became a museum. The museum contains several exhibits across 3 floors. The first floor features the Family Immigration History Center, Peopling of America, and New Eras of Immigration exhibits. The second floor has the Through America's Gate exhibit and Peak Immigration Years. The third floor contains a dormitory room, Silent Voices exhibit, Treasures from Home, and the Ellis Island Chronicles. There are also 3 theaters used for film and live performances. The third floor contains a library, reading room, and oral history center. There are auditoriums on all floors, and on the ground floor is a gift shop and bookstore, as well as a booth for audio tours. In 2008, despite opposition from the NPS, the museum's library was officially renamed the Bob Hope Memorial Library. This was in honor of one of the station's most famous immigrants, Bob Hope. On the first day of its opening, 600 immigrants were admitted through Ellis Island. Over the next year, over 400,000 passed through this port of entry. From 1892 to 1924, approximately 12 million immigrants arriving at the Port of New York and New Jersey were processed through Ellis Island. It's estimated that about 40% of all current U.S. citizens can trace at least one of their ancestors to Ellis Island, which is positioned at the mouth of the Hudson River in New York.
Occupying only 3 acres at one point in history, Ellis Island grew to encompass 27 acres of land. But its small footprint had major impact on the country. We wouldn't be the great melting pot we are today without Ellis Island. If you were to visit the island right now, you would find yourself at the northern side of the Statue of Liberty National Monument. The southern island hosts the most famous New Yorker, the Statue of Liberty on Liberty Island. The base of the Statue of Liberty bears a quote emblematic of the American spirit that led to the founding of Ellis Island.
"Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Emma Lazarus. As America opened its golden door to new beginnings, Christians in the United States saw golden opportunity. As the foreign missions movement was gaining momentum, churches, denominations, and Christian organizations saw a new mission field emerging on the home front. While they were sending missionaries out into the world, multitudes of men, women, and children were on their way to them. America's ports of entry became prime land for planting seeds of the gospel. Missionaries went to work in Boston, Philadelphia, and of course, Ellis Island.
The mission movement in America's ports of entry became so prevalent that its own periodical was circulated, uniting many Protestant denominations and organizations in the work of welcoming new immigrants. In the Ports of Entry Missionary Herald, one minister writes,
"No part of the immigrant welcome service is more important than that which is done by the missionaries. Their purpose is primarily to carry the gospel story of salvation and good cheer. Behold, I bring you glad tidings of great joy is the message of the Ports of Entry missionary. This work, however, combines regard for spiritual life and material welfare. It must be humanitarian and philanthropic service of a very practical sort. It is the cup of water in his name, given with the personal touch of one of his disciples." With this philosophy in mind, Christian missionaries rallied to provide clothing, food, shelter, education, and even healthcare to the incoming citizens being held at Ellis Island. One of the longest residing missionaries, Jenny F. Pratt, ran a school for children, finding innovative ways to bridge language barriers, instructing both students and parents alike in everything from reading and arithmetic to basic hygiene. Sometimes her kindergarten classroom would be filled with 200 students in one day. But she was relentlessly committed to her mission, and after 3 decades of missionary service at Ellis Island, Jenny F. Pratt retired with the moniker Mrs. Liberty of Ellis Island. As citizens of so-called enemy nations at the time found their way to America's shores, missionaries like Mrs. Pratt saw the opportunity to embrace the humanity and God-given value of each individual.
The processing procedure at Ellis Island took time, and through its process, about 2% of potential immigrants were rejected and deported. The waiting was difficult for families, and many of the missionary efforts were devoted to comforting and encouraging immigrants on the cusp of their new beginnings.
The New York Bible Society provided Bibles in 86 languages at Ellis Island so that individuals from virtually any nation could find access to the comfort of Scripture in their native tongue. They distributed hundreds of thousands of Bibles and tracts each year, and they were not alone in their work. They were joined by over 30 other national organizations and agencies, including the YMCA, YWCA, the Salvation Army, and missionary agencies from virtually every Christian denomination.
The impact Ellis Island had on the missions movement in the United States is truly remarkable. It's no accident Ellis Island has been nicknamed the Isle of Hope. The church came together in innovative ways to embrace the new mission field ripening on our nation's shores. I'm reminded of Jesus' words in John 4:35. Open your eyes and look at the fields, because they are already ripe for harvest. Thankfully, the church at the time took those words to heart.